Good day, everyone. I am R Dano and I will be discussing investigating sexual abuse on investigator's perspective. First, we must know the investigator's responsibilities. As an investigator, you are responsible for ensuring appropriate and professional follow-up on criminal cases. This often involves various tasks such as investigating crime scenes, managing evidence, analyzing crimes, and conducting interviews with victims, witnesses, and suspects. Practices for conducting investigations provide useful information and support, and they serve as reminders to investigators, supervisors, and administrators responsible for overseeing and reviewing criminal case files. These are the fundamental actions that we will be discussing today. First is the first responders investigative role. Second is assigned investigator role and responsible standards. Third is core investigative follow-up steps. And fourth is ensuring a professional law enforcement response. For our first fundamental actions is the first responder investigative role. The first law enforcement officer on the scene of a reported crime is crucial to ensuring a successful investigation and outcome. The first responder must take quick action to protect the integrity of the investigation, regardless whether the investigation is initiated immediately after the incident or is delayed. So, sino nga ba ang mga first responders? Based on the document received from Ms. Ina Buted, first responders are members of the police, military, fire, medical teams, and other volunteer organizations who are expected to be the first to respond to calls for assistance in cases of incidents. And there are four main tasks of the first officer on the scene. First is to give first aid. Second is to apprehend the suspected offender. Third is to protect and, if necessary, collect and preserve evidence. And lastly is to cordon off and protect the area. And here we have the general investigative procedures na ginagamit din sa sexual abuse investigation. Upon the receipt of call or walk-in complainants, the duty desk officer shall record the time it was reported, then get the identity of the caller or complainant, get the place of incident and the nature of incident, then get the number of victims kung ilan ba ang mga biktima, then record a brief synopsis of the incident, and direct the nearest mobile car or beat patrollers or the nearest police precinct to act as first responders equipped with police line to secure the place of incident. Then lastly is to inform the duty investigator. When the first responders arrive at the crime scene, they shall perform their duty and in addition, check the condition of the victim while the other members of the first responders shall simultaneously secure the area by putting a police line or any material. If in serious condition na ang victim, they shall bring the victim immediately to the nearest hospital using emergency services. Kailangan pagka rating nila sa crime scene, ay tumawag na agad sila sa ambulansya para madala agad ang victim sa nearest hospital para hindi sila matuluyan ng pagkamatay. Then, if the victim is dead, get their photograph and make a sketch of the victim. And kung hindi pa naman patay pero mamamatay na ang victim, get their dying declaration if necessary. And ask these three questions. First is, what is your name and your address? Then, who did this to you? And do you think the wounds you received are fatal? And kung hindi naman masyadong seryoso ang kondisyon ng ating mga biktima, maaari pa rin or kailangan pa rin silang dalhin sa pinakamalapit na ospital, then get the identity and other data of the victim, and get initial interview from the victim. Then the next task of a first responder is to apprehend the suspected offender in their area. If the suspect is arrested at the crime scene, get the name of the persons who turned over or arrested the suspects. Isolate the arrested suspects and separate them from any probable witness of the incident. Bakit nga ba kailangan nating ihiwalay ang mga witnesses sa suspects? Kasi kayang-kaya ng suspect na i-blackmail ang witness para hindi sila magsalita against him. Kaya kailangan talaga natin silang paghiwalayin. The next is to record what time the suspect was arrested, then wait for the investigator to interview the suspect. And if the suspect volunteers any statement, take note of the time, location, and circumstances of the statement. For our next fundamental actions is assigned investigator role and responsibilities standards. As the assigned investigator, you are responsible for overall management and progression of the case, for ensuring that you complete all critical tasks, exhaust all leads, and completely follow up all germane information. An investigator should be assigned at the earliest possible time after the initial report. Agency resources may be a factor in meeting this standard. At times, you may be assigned on the next business day, and this response may be appropriate if the initial report is delayed or there is no imminent public safety risk. First, sino nga ba ang mga duty investigator or assigned investigator? The duty investigator is the duly assigned or designated to conduct the inquiry of the crime by following a systematic set of procedure and methodologies for the purpose of identifying witnesses, recovering evidence, arresting, and prosecuting perpetrators. So, sila yung mga nag-i-investigate ng crime scene, sila yung mga nagko-collect ng evidence, then sila din, halimbawa na lang, kung ang perpetrator ay nasa crime scene pa, sila din ang nag-a-arrest at nagpa-prosecute sa kanila. The task of investigators on case is to proceed the investigation at the crime scene. Upon arrival of the investigator on case at the crime scene, they shall receive the crime scene from the first responders. Bakit nga ba nire-receive natin ang crime scene sa first responders? Dahil ang first responders, sila yung nakakaalam kung ano na yung mga nangyayari at nangyari na sa crime scene. Kung ano na yung balita sa victim, kung ano yung, kung meron ba or naandun ba sa crime scene ang perpetrator nung pumunta ang first responders. So, lahat ng documents ay dapat kunin ng investigator on case sa first responders. Then, they should record the time and date of arrival at the crime scene, location of the crime scene, then condition of the weather, condition and type of lighting, direction of wind and visibility. Bakit nga ba natin to nire-record itong mga elements na to? Halimbawa na lang sa condition of the weather and sa direction of wind. Sa rape with homicide case, halimbawa ang victim ay nasa post-mortem na. Makikita natin na nagdidecay na yung katawan ng tao, katawan ng victim. Maaari na nakaka-affect itong mga elements na to sa pagdecay ng katawan ng victim. Then next is to photograph and or video the entire crime scene. Then before entering the crime scene, all investigators must put on surgical gloves para hindi natin matamper ang evidence. Before touching or moving any object at the crime scene in a homicide or murder case, as well as the sexual assault case is to determine first the status of the victim, whether he is still alive or already dead. Then designate a member of the team or ask other policemen to stand watch and secure the scene and permit only authorized persons to enter the scene. Identify and retain for questioning the person who first notified the police and other possible witness. And lastly, at the crime scene, determine the assailant through inquiry or observe him if his identity is immediately apparent. Arrest him if he is still in the vicinity. Then the preceding task of a duty investigator is to record. The investigator begins the process of recording pertinent facts and details of the investigation the moment he arrives at the crime scene. So, ang pagre-record po ng investigator ay simula sa pagkarating niya sa crime scene, sa pagkuha niya ng crime scene sa first responders hanggang sa nasa korte na ang kasong ito. Then, he shall search for evidence and collect all of the evidence. This is accomplished after the search is completed. The rough sketch and photographs are taken. Fragile evidence is collected as soon as they are found. All firearms found to have tampered serial numbers shall be automatically subjected to macro etching at the PNP Crime Lab. Then the next task is markings of evidence. Any physical evidence obtained must be marked or tagged before its submission to the evidence custodian. The markings of evidence must at least contain the exhibit case number, initials and or signature of the collecting officer, then the time and date of collection. Next task of the duty investigator is to evaluate the evidence. If necessary, these pieces of evidence must be subjected to crime laboratory examination. Halimbawa na lang sa rape case, kailangan yung victim or yung cadaver na victim or yung victim na buhay pa ay makuhaan ng sample sa kanyang genital parts para makita kung may semen ba or kung talaga bang na-penetrate siya. Kasi kapag kasi rape case, medyo mahirap siyang ipanalo sa korte kasi kailangan talaga meron kang evidence na ikaw ay na-penetrate. Halimbawa na lamang dito is yung damit nung hinipuang victim. Hindi pwedeng hawakan ng investigator or kahit na sino yung damit na yun hanggat nang walang gloves hanggat hindi pa naibibigay sa evidence custodian. Bakit nga ba? Kapag hinawakan yung damit na yon nang walang gloves, mapupunta dun yung fingerprint ng ibang tao. So, matatamper nun yung evidence na meron yung damit na yon to prosecute any suspects. Then, the next task of investigators is to release the evidence. All collected evidence can only be released upon order of the court or prosecutor. Then the next responsibility is chain of custody. A list of all persons who came into possession of an item of evidence, continuity of possession, or the chain of custody must be established whenever evidence is presented in court as an exhibit. Kailangan at mahalaga po ang chain of custody dahil ito po ay maaring ma-question kung hindi maayos ang chain of custody. Ang ating evidence ay maki-question kapag hindi maayos ang chain of custody. Then the next task is the transmittal of evidence to the crime laboratory. The following principles should be observed in handling all types of evidence. The evidence should reach the laboratory in same condition as when it was found. The quantity of specimens should be adequate. Then submit a known or standard specimen for comparison purposes. Then keep each specimen separate from others so that there will be no intermingling or mixing of known and unknown material. Mark or label of each of the evidence for positive identification as the evidence taken from a particular location in connection with the crime under investigation. Then the chain of custody of evidence must be maintained. And sa other sexual assault naman, halimbawa na lamang ay hinipuan ako or hinawakan ako sa aking private parts, kailangan yung damit ng victim ay hindi matamper kasi yun ay nagko-contain ng fingerprint ng suspect. The next task of the duty investigator is preserving of evidence. It is investigators' responsibility to ensure that every precaution is exercised to preserve the evidence in the state which it was recovered or obtained until it is released to evidence custodian. For our next fundamental actions is the core investigative follow-up steps. Although sexual assault investigations do not always follow the same case flow, be sure that you do all of the following. These foundational steps apply regardless of whether the offender is known to the victim. Making them your regular practice can lead to better case resolution. For our first core investigative follow-up step is to assess the information. This is one of the first steps in investigation and a critical step to continue throughout its duration. This threshold assessment may take into account factors or actions that have already occurred, such as an active crime scene, timing of the initial report, custodial status of one or more suspects, and the need to issue search warrants or involve investigative expertise, and ongoing danger to the community. Carefully analyze the information given by the first responders or documented in the initial report, and be prepared to continually reassess the case as facts emerge. Even when the report of an assault is delayed, perishable evidence might still exist. If so, collect it as soon as possible. Whether you are called to the initial scene or assigned the case later, complete the following. First is to review and document any initial briefing or information provided by the first responders. Second is to observe and document physical conditions, witnesses, and anyone else involved. Third is to identify what information is known and what information is unknown. And lastly is to create a checklist and prioritize the next steps. For our second core investigative follow-up step is to complete the interviewing fundamentals. Obtaining information from victims, witnesses, and suspects is a foundational step in investigative response. Accurate and complete statements are important to any case, and interviews are enhanced by establishing trust and rapport with anyone who has case information. Seeking training in one or more advanced interviewing techniques, sexual assault cases require you to account for the victim's emotional state at the time of the crime and during the subsequent police interviews. You should understand the trauma and be properly trained in conducting interviews with this understanding. Apply a cognitive-based, trauma-informed interview method to enhance the information obtained and minimize the impact of trauma. The fundamental principle is that you allow the interviewee to provide an uninterrupted narrative of the event. One study found that more information uh, sorry about that. One study found that investigators who have proper training in applying this type of interviewing strategy are able to elicit 55% more information than those without training. Strive to establish a connection with the victim and any other interview subjects that allows them to see you as more than just a fact collector. For the victim interviews, carefully consider which investigator is best suited for completing the victim interview, where it should take place, and how it will be conducted. Conducted the interview early in the investigative process may help keep the victim engaged by conveying a feeling of support and the need for ongoing contact. On the other hand, conducting the interview too quickly after the assault while the victim may still be under the effects of traumatic event could result in the statements appearing disjointed, incomplete, or confusing. To help mitigate these challenges, employ victim advocates before, during, and after the interview process to enhance victim interactions throughout the investigation. The fundamental steps that and minimal standards of information in a victim interview are as follows. First is to consider consulting with the district attorney before interviewing the victim and inviting prosecutor for a joint interview. Second is to make arrangement to record the interview, audio or audio video. Third is to identify a private and safe location for the interview. Next is to obtain contact information and establish elements of crime or crimes. Then, if the offender is known to the victim, establish their relationship history. If the offender is not known to the victim, obtain information about the offender's identifying physical characteristics. Next is to establish any potential crime scenes and evidence. Then identify any potential witnesses and identify one or more suspects. Then lastly is to enhance communication by employing a cognitive approach to the interview. Open-ended and non-accusatory questions allow the victim to explain events in his or her own words. Next is the witness interviews. Thoroughly interview all identified witnesses. Note that witnesses may include persons who were not at the scene of the assault but have valuable information about events before or after the crime incident. For case purposes, witnesses can include those with third-party information, although their testimony may not be allowed in a trial. Follow these recommended steps for conducting a witness interview. First is to conduct the interview in a private location and away from the other potential witnesses. Second is to record the interview whenever possible using audio or audio video. Then obtain contact information of the witness and establish the witness's role in the events, wherein witnesses may provide links to the other evidence, or witnesses may have additional information and not realize its relevance, such as information about normal behavior of people or vehicles typically in an area. Next is to identify the relationship the witness has with the victim, suspects, or any key persons. Then to determine the identity of one or more suspects or obtain the most accurate description available. Next is to use open-ended questions to allow witnesses to describe events in their own words and ask witnesses whether they can identify one or more other people to talk to or sources of evidence to consider, and lastly is to ensure that all interviews and any unsuccessful attempts to contact witnesses are documented in the case file. For our next core investigative follow-up steps is locate and process relevant crime scenes and evidence. As stated by Balu et al. 2013, a thorough investigation includes a response to and an assessment of the crime scene. You or your designee is responsible to ensure that evidence or information discovered is documented and collected. During a crime scene investigation, you must remain aware of and act in accordance with all federal state laws regarding searching and seizing of property. These follow-up steps can ensure that the evidence collected can be used in any future proceeding. If the case is acute, follow up immediately. Consider factors such as whether the incident just occurred and the police were immediately notified, or the suspect is on the scene or in custody. First is to physically locate the crime scene and secure and control access to the scene. For our next step is to observe the scene and assess the scene for processing needs. Next is to process the scene, follow agency policy and procedures, ensure that photographs depicting the scene and forensic photography of the victim's condition and injuries are completed. Ensure that forensic and physical evidence is properly collected. Properly impound and store all items collected, and when on scene, conduct an area canvass. Note location of surveillance equipment or other video monitoring systems that may be analyzed later. Document people who were contacted and locations where no one was available. The next step in locating and processing relevant crime scenes and evidence is to collect and preserve any 911 calls and tapes. And lastly is to preserve additional electronic communications, including text messages, photographs, and social media. For our next investigative follow-up step is to obtain and process a sexual assault evidence kit. A significant piece of potential evidence in a sexual assault is the sexual assault kit or SAK. The SAK offers you one more potential source of critical information for the case, including the potential of forensic linkage to other crimes. Investigators are responsible for handling, impounding, and processing of this evidence. Specifically, if you are the lead case investigator, and you must ensure these things. First is the agency policy is in place for kit management. Next is SAKs are secured immediately and submitted to the agency with jurisdiction within 14 days. Then requests for laboratory kit analysis and the actual analysis are made in a timely manner. Next is that all transfers and movements of the kit along with any results are tracked and documented in the case file. And lastly, additional DNA elimination samples are collected, if applicable, from suspects and witnesses. For our next core investigative follow-up step is to connect or refer the victim to an advocate. Victims who have the assistance of an advocate are more likely to receive supportive services after the crime, remain engaged in the criminal justice process, and report lower levels of distress after interactions with the legal system. Victims' advocates can also provide a means to incorporate personal knowledge of victims' rights, along with the thoughtful plans for educating and assisting victims in exercising those rights. Familiarize yourself with the role of victim advocates and incorporate their skills and training throughout the investigative process. Stay in contact with victims throughout the investigative and court processes and maintain a supportive role. For our sixth core investigative follow-up step is reassess all the information known. Carefully review all information and evidence collected during the investigation to determine investigative strategies and to weigh case continuance. This step is important to avoid developing tunnel of vision or missing key steps. This assessment, which is appropriate for both known and unknown offender cases, can also be helpful in creating a further investigative strategy and potential interview with strategy for when you contact a suspect. After you have been processed the crime scene and conducted initial interviews, you shall do the following. First is to evaluate the available information. Convene a case status debriefing with additional investigation. The next investigative steps and your strategy may depend on evidence uncovered during the initial response and statements collected from all parties. You should seek out any missing information or try to answer questions so far unanswered. Next is when evidence is collected, assess its investigative value and submit appropriate evidence to a crime laboratory for analysis. Work to corroborate specific details from the victim and witness interviews with details at the crime scene. Consider whether to conduct additional follow-up interviews with witnesses, the victim, or both determine the value and meaning of the evidence and to locate other potential sources. For our next core investigative follow-up steps is to contact the suspect if one has been identified. Obtaining the suspect's statement is a key element of a thorough investigation. No matter what you may anticipate that the suspect will say or not say, any information you get can be helpful in resolving a case. How to conduct the interview and when to make contact are dependent on the known facts and circumstances of the case. Consider whether the suspect has a prior relationship to the victim or is a stranger, the victim has safety concerns, or the suspect is a present danger to the community. Interviewing a suspect allows you to ask the suspect critical questions about facts of the case, gives the suspect the opportunity to explain actions and events, and may elicit a confession or an admission about specific details. Be sure that all your action in relation to the suspect follow all applicable legal rules. Seek training in one or more advanced interviewing techniques. You must also consider any forensic evidence obtained from the suspect. This potentially valuable evidence could assist in supporting or refuting any investigative statement. Be prepared for a variety of responses and potential options when you contact the suspect. The next fundamental steps and minimal standards of information in suspect interview are as follows. Ensure officer safety. Second is record all interview conversations. Next is to ensure legal custody or establish consensual contact elements. Then provide a private room and location. Next is use an open-ended question, apply the cognitive interview strategy, allowing the suspect to explain what he or she knows about the assault. Next is to build rapport while you identify themes about the assault and victim. Next is to identify and preserve any potential evidence presented from the suspect in a manner that satisfies all legal requirements. Next is to consider setting up a recorded pretext phone call or a text message exchange if the victim is willing to contact the suspect. Keep in mind that many victims will not be emotionally willing or able to participate in such an effort. Contact should be initiated only by the victim and only when she or he is ready to participate. After the interview, engage the victim advocacy for safety planning with the victim. For our next core investigative follow-up step is to continue case assessment and evaluation. Over the course of the investigation, routinely assess the case to ensure that you are not missing key details or inferring information that is not contained in the data you have gathered. Confirm that all areas of inquiry have been completed and evaluated, like the likelihood that the case will move forward. This may also be a key time to consider using additional investigative techniques such as making a controlled or pretext telephone call, conducting surveillance, and polygraphing a suspect. As in previous stages, use a standardized investigative checklist to do the following. First is to confirm that all crime scene evidence was collected and document its own status if known. Second is to ensure that perishable or transient evidence such as a surveillance video is identified and collected. Third is to confirm that all witnesses, including the suspect, have been contacted. The suspect may have said something that warrants going back to the crime scene and completing additional areas of the inquiry. Next is to review any results from crime laboratory analysis of evidence. Then identify investigative needs and gaps for follow-up assignment. And lastly is to fully inform the victim and provide him or her with advocacy for support and engagement. For our next core investigative follow-up step is to support the investigation through intelligence, analysis, and research. Thoroughly investigating sexual assault cases can be complex and resource dependent. Deploy team members effectively to ensure that all investigative information, including from witnesses, suspects, and the crime scene, is properly reviewed, assessed, evaluated, and disseminated. A crime analyst can fill this critical need and assist in furthering the investigative process. Coordinating this effort is a key in completing fundamental case analysis. For our next core investigative follow-up step is to complete the written report and documentation. Documenting investigative action is critical to preserving the work you have completed. The final report is a key factor in downstream case decisions that include prosecutorial review, judicial review and trial, as well as the future case connectivity. Take care when completing the written report. Arrange for oversight and supervisory review on each case. Document the following fundamental facts and information in your report. All case activity you completed and tasks that were attempted but not completed. All interviews of key individuals, as well as all failed attempts to interview subjects and reasons that any given interview was not possible. third is that actions taken by all involved police personnel. Next is observation of the scene by officers and witnesses along with any evidence collected. Then lastly is to contact or interact with the victim advocacy or support services. And last, for our core investigative follow-up step is to follow procedures for final case disposition and investigative closure. When you have completed all investigative tasks, closing and finalizing the case is an important part of your agency's strategies. Follow national case clearance standards established by the FBI. Refer to the National Incident-Based Reporting System User Manual, Federal Bureau of Investigation 2018. This standard should be included in your department's written policy. Include the role of the supervisor in conducting case oversight to ensure that consistent clearance standards are being met. And lastly, for our fundamental actions, ensuring a professional law enforcement response. Developing and following standards of practice are fundamental aspects of all professional disciplines. In policing, such standards draw investigators a map of core expectations that guide them and officers to a consistent professional response. The investigation of sexual assault is no exception. Conducting a comprehensive, intelligent investigation of a sexual assault is essential in ensuring justice for the victim and accountability for the offender. To achieve this goal, investigators must be able to follow developed standards of investigative practice. And that's all for my report. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I am R Dano and I reported about the investigating sexual abuse on investigators' perspective.